A small boy runs desperately through the alleyways. He is being chased by 4 boys and is soon caught, beaten, and robbed of his coin. They then call him a bastardo and leave. As he lays there, bruised and exhausted, he looks up at the sky and sees a fleet of aircraft from Lavam Air Force passing by. He longs for the day that he can be free of poverty and hardships, flying high and proudly in the sky like the Lavam Air Force. Years pass by. A beautiful silver-haired girl is being carefully dressed by 2 servants under the watchful eye of the steward. Her name is Fana, and she is the princess of the Del Moral family. Fana's father enters the room and sternly reminds her that they cannot afford to make any mistakes at the ball, currently being held in the main hall. This is because their family's future depends on the union that is anticipated between her and the prince. Down in the main hall, Colonel Garcia prepares to initiate a casual discussion with the prince. But this is interrupted when Lady Fana enters the ball so gracefully that it causes everyone to stop and watch in awe and adoration. Prince Carlo, who is visibly smitten by her beauty. He immediately proposes to her, and she accepts. However, Prince Carlo reminds her that the kingdom of San Maltilia is still at war with the Matsukami, and he politely requests that she waits 1 year for the war to be over before they carry out the ceremony. More than 1 year passes, but the war shows no end in sight. Lady Fana is starting to wonder if Prince Carlo will uphold his promise, but her servants remain optimistic since he still sends her letters every day. One night, Fana decides to gaze through her window at the beautiful countryside, but her attention is instantly drawn to a small fleet of a Matsukami aircraft swiftly approaching the mansion. Before she can utter a sound, the aircraft releases a series of bombs onto the mansion, and everywhere is covered in flames within seconds. Some servants flee in terror, while others try to help those who are trapped under the rubble. Diego del Moral, Fana's father, is also killed in the incident. At Diego's funeral, Colonel Garcia informs the butler of the de Moral family that the Matsukami Air Force attack was an attempt to kill Lady Fana. Therefore, Prince Carlo has personally requested that she be escorted back to the mainland by the 8th Division Special Fleet. Elsewhere, first-rank pilot Charles Carino has a dream that he is flying a Lavam aircraft while trying to outmaneuver the enemy. He is eventually shot down by the enemy in the dream and is startled awake. Later that day, Charles is seated for lunch in the barracks with his friend Joaquim. He is bullied by 2 older officers to wash their laundry, but this quickly dissipates the moment Charles is summoned to the command office. Charles enters and sees Colonel Garcia staring at him in a deliberate and scrutinizing manner. The colonel decides to get straight to the point. He wants Charles to escort Lady Fana across the Central Ocean by seaplane to Prince. The colonel brings out a map and asks Charles to illustrate how he plans to circumvent the obstacles. Charles highlights that he will need to make 3 stops to recharge the aircraft's battery throughout the entire journey. Charles also mentions his concern about the enemy having access to newer models of aircraft, which are too technologically advanced to try to outrun or outmaneuver. However, the lieutenant present in the room reassured Charles that they will be providing him with a newer reconnaissance model named the Santa Cruz, which should make things a bit easier for him. Nighttime falls, and all of Charles' friends are celebrating his luck for being selected to carry out such an important mission. However, Charles is weary about the situation. Days later, the colonel is escorting Charles to meet Fana, and he warns Charles not to speak to Fana at any point throughout the mission, other than to reply to yes or no. Charles agrees and eventually leaves to go board the seaplane, while Fana is still being updated by the colonel. While leaving, the lieutenant tells Charles that he has left a surprise by his feet in the seaplane. Moments after Charles boards the plane, he discovers a bottle of brandy in a box by his feet. Lady Fana's servants are livid that there is a weight limit for the seaplane because they have packed many suitcases that Fana cannot live without. They bully the technician into packing all of the suitcases onto the aircraft, even though it had the potential to compromise the speed and maneuverability of the aircraft. Moments later, the princess is escorted onto the plane, and Charles takes off. Later that evening, they land at sea, and Charles politely asks her to throw away anything she doesn't need. She sulks at this request and eventually slips and falls into the sea with the contents of one of her suitcases. Charles immediately jumps in to save her. Charles is successful, but they can't rest just yet. A fleet of enemy aircraft is headed their way, so Fana is forced to leave her suitcases behind as they flee to safety. Charles then recharges the plane with seawater, which he anticipates should last him for 1 whole day of flying. The next day, they travel for a while, and since Fana is seated facing toward the rear of the plane, she notices enemy aircraft approaching on the upper right side. Charles confirms this, and they fly out of the enemy's line of sight. Later that night, they have dinner on a raft next to the landed seaplane, and Charles reveals to Fauna that his mission is to take her to Scion Island, where an airship will be waiting to pick her up. Fauna comments on the fact that the 8th Division Special Fleet would essentially be taking credit for his hard work, but Charles isn't concerned with gaining fame for carrying out the mission, especially since he will be paid handsomely for the job. Charles plans to retire after the mission and live out his life comfortably on a foreign island. Suddenly, Charles hears the sound of an aircraft, so he dims the lamp and uses a pair of binoculars to spot the enemy's location. He sees airships in the distance with spotlights on the ocean, as if they are currently searching for something. Charles believes that the Amatsukami forces may know of their plan, and Fauna wonders if the enemy has managed to intercept a coded telegram. She then reveals that Prince Carlos sent her a letter via a military telegraph, commenting on his disapproval of the plan to transport Fauna alone to Scion Island without the protection of the guard. Charles realizes that their plan may indeed be compromised, and he becomes upset at Prince Carlos's careless action. Charles eventually regains his composure and decides that they just have to be extra careful. He encourages Fauna to be vigilant to spot any enemy aircraft approaching from the rear of the seaplane, since if they notice the enemy early enough, they have a good chance of being able to escape. Charles decides to head to the seaplane to sleep, and Fauna falls into the ocean again while rushing towards him to tell him something. He saves her, and she tells him that he should sleep on the raft with her since sleeping on the seaplane might be very uncomfortable. Charles realizes that he has been doing a lot more talking to Fauna than he is supposed to. He has a flashback of his past, where he is a young child being bullied by the royal groundskeeper for being a bastardo and for having the audacity to work at the royal mansion with his mother. He is later comforted by Fauna, who was also a young child at the time. In the present, he drifts off to sleep. It is clear that Fauna doesn't remember their past interactions. The next day while they are flying, Fauna notices a distortion in the clouds, but doesn't understand it. Charles is immediately alert because from experience, he knows that airships cause distortions of that nature. It's too late. 8 large enemy aircraft descend from right above them. They are surrounded. The enemy fires missiles synchronously, and Charles maneuvers the seaplane in a way that causes some of the enemy's missiles to collide with one of their own aircraft. Fauna watches on as dozens of Amatsukami mercenaries fall from the damaged airship to their deaths. Charles is also wounded by the firepower of the new type of enemy aircraft. He loses consciousness, and the seaplane begins to fall while being fired at the new type of enemy aircraft. She grabs the machine gun located at the rear of the seaplane and presses the trigger, but nothing happens. Charles awakens and uses the overboost function that is a unique feature of this Santa Cruz. They increase speed, but the enemy is relentless. A chase ensues, and the enemy pilots are forced to admit that whoever is flying the seaplane must be a highly skilled pilot, since he is able to evade them for this long. The new Type Division 6 fleet eventually receive a command from their colonel to return to the main ship because they have ventured too far. The enemy gives up and returns to the main ship. Charles is almost overcome by his wounds, but manages to pass the Great Falls and crash land the seaplane into the water. Fauna treats his wounds, and Charles eventually awakens to see a half-dressed Fauna looking directly at him. While he was asleep, she cut her hair. Charles takes a look at the damage done to the Seacraft and concludes that he needs to try to repair it. Fauna is determined to help, since Charles is injured. They spend a few days in that remote location, fixing the plane and getting to know each other. One evening, they are sitting next to a cliff overlooking the seaside, and Fauna hums a tune that Charles knows all too well. His mother, Chise, who was Fauna's maid at the royal mansion, used to also sing that song to him at bedtime as a child. He tells Fauna that he used to work in the inner garden of the mansion, while his mother worked inside the manor. Fauna realizes that Chise is Charles' mother, and later tells him that when she was younger, she was afraid of the dark, but Chise would always come to her room and sing to her so she could fall asleep. However, one day Fauna's father realized this and fired Chise on the spot. Fauna still feels guilty for being the reason Chise was fired, but Charles comforts her and lets her know that his mother cherished her time working in the mansion. However, he tells her that Chise passed away not too long after being fired from the mansion. Fauna is overcome with guilt and begins to cry. Charles comforts her, but Fauna says that she doesn't want to return to the capital. Fauna declares that she wants to travel to a foreign island with Charles and live a quiet life. Charles tells her that it is important for the kingdom's people if she is brought to the capital as promised, and Fauna becomes upset. She grabs the bottle of liquor left to Charles by the lieutenant and begins to drink furiously. She calls Charles a coward and becomes careless with her words. She then forces Charles to dance in her drunken state and after the two fall over, he realizes he might have feelings for her, but doesn't outwardly acknowledge this. She cries, and he eventually sings his mother's lullaby to Fauna as she falls asleep. The next day, they prepare the seaplane for flight. Charles mentions that he expects the enemy to be patrolling the area in search of them, and Fauna asks him to show her how to use the machine gun at the rear of the plane. During flight, Charles shows her how to remove the safety, but the enemy has already begun pursuit. 7 air cruisers surround them and fire relentlessly. Charles manages to outrun them, but soon notices a Sol Amatsuvian fighter plane preparing to duel with him. As the duel is underway, Charles realizes that the Amatsuvian pilot is also very highly skilled. The enemy pilot is able to match every maneuver with ease, so Charles pulls out his ace move. Charles powers the seaplane into the sky and does a sudden nosedive that catches the enemy pilot off guard. However, the enemy also has an ace up his sleeve and counteracts by flipping his aircraft so it balances out right behind the seaplane. Charles is stunned. He knows they are done for, but Fauna has her own ace up her sleeve. She lines the enemy up in her sights and fires. She destroys the enemy craft's left wing, and he loses the battle with his life intact. They reach Scion Island and wait for the arrival of the Lavam airship. Fauna asks Charles to come with her to the mainland, but he tells her that it is not possible. She becomes upset and asks if he isn't affected by the prospect of never seeing her again. Charles is unable to respond. The Lavam airship arrives. Charles and Fauna give each other heartfelt goodbyes. Soon after, Charles is struck down by a Lavam mercenary who pockets some of his reward before dragging Fauna back to the airship with 2 other mercenaries. Fauna is outraged because Charles remains kneeling until the airship departs. However, she becomes elated when she sees the Santa Cruz flying alongside the Lavam aircraft. She forces the Lavam mercenaries to step aside so that she can say goodbye to Charles. She reaches the deck in time to see Charles maneuvering around the Lavam airship and releasing his gold coin payment into the air, which fell like gold dust into the sky. He then flew off into the sky, like a proud pilot that he always dreamed of being.